In the early 1980s, I was a legal assistant at a law firm in Charleston, South Carolina. My fiancé, now husband, and I were staying at my sister's house until we could find a place to rent. While at work one day, I had mentioned to one of the law clerks that we were trying to find a place, and he said his family had a house on a nearby island and that part of it was a rental. He asked if we would be interested in it, and we told him we wanted to see it. We loved it. Not only was it on the island, it was right on the beach. High tide was only a few hundred yards away. We settled in and loved beach life. We had a key to the upstairs apartment, which the family kept for their family gatherings, but the owner had given it to us just so we could check on it if anything seemed problematic. Although they were in the area, they didn't stay at the house often, and when they did, it was usually for a weekend get-together during a holiday. The first thing we noticed were the footsteps upstairs. We didn't pay that much attention since we thought it might be a family member who had stopped by. However, after one incident, when we knew the family member who also lived on the island was out of town, we decided to check upstairs just to be sure no one was up there who shouldn't be. We had just checked to make sure that no one had arrived by car, but we continued to hear footsteps. My fiancé went upstairs and looked around, but no one appeared to be in any part of the house. However, when he came back into our apartment, the footsteps started again. As this continued, we made it a mission to check upstairs when we heard the footsteps, but no one was ever there. We weren't scared or spooked by the footsteps and definitely weren't hesitant about going and checking, and sometimes I would go upstairs to get ice from the ice maker if we were not having guests over. My only thought was that it was always nice and cool upstairs, although no air conditioning was on and no windows were open. It didn't cross my mind at the time that this was a little strange, since summers in South Carolina are pretty hot. Shortly after we started investigating the footsteps, a new incident occurred. It sounded as if one of the toilets was running constantly. The first time my husband went to investigate this new problem, I was downstairs, standing under the location where the upstairs toilet was and hoping it was not overflowing. My husband wasn't gone long and came back in and said nothing was malfunctioning upstairs, although we both still heard the same sound as if the toilet was running constantly. We both went upstairs to a peaceful and quiet apartment. Downstairs, however, the sound from above continued. We got used to it and the footsteps. My fiancé had served in Vietnam and had a silver St. Christopher on a chain that he had always kept with him since then in his pocket. In the evenings, he would empty his pockets on a chest in the master bedroom. He got up one morning, got dressed, and was putting his things in his pocket when he asked me where his St. Christopher was. I had not touched anything on the chest, so I had no idea where it was and told him he must have misplaced it. He swore he put it there the night before. We looked all around the chest, in drawers, we moved it from the wall, and then continued the search throughout the house. He was very upset about the possibility that it was missing, but we had looked everywhere we thought it might possibly be. That day at work, the girlfriend, who we will call Vicky, of my coworker, whose house we were renting, stopped by. I was telling her the story of the St. Christopher and about how much it meant to my husband. Very casually, she said, "Oh, it must be Lindsay." My response was, "Who was Lindsay?" She told me it was the daughter of the family who owned the house. Obviously, I was very puzzled, wondering why Lindsay would come in and take something from our apartment. She laughed and said, "Oh, she does that all the time." I guess she realized I had no idea who she was talking about and very casually told me that Lindsay was dead, that she had been killed on the West Coast after getting on the wrong side of some associates. She then went on to tell me of the incidences that had happened upstairs when Lindsay visited. Once, a cherished ring had disappeared from a side table in the living room when Vicky had taken it off to go to the beach. The house was thoroughly searched, but the ring was nowhere to be found. They went out to dinner and returned several hours later to find the ring lying on the table precisely where Vicky had said it was placed. She said it wasn't unusual for strange things to happen when the family gathered there. She told me that at one point, before we moved, that a relative of Lindsay's was living in the apartment we were in. He said he had fallen asleep on the sofa and awoke to wind and leaves blowing through the apartment, although the double doors were locked and one side bolted to the top and bottom of the door frame. Both doors were wide open. He wasted no time leaving, I was told. She said during one holiday weekend a heavy crystal bowl, which I believe had been a gift from Lindsay to her mother, had flown out of an upper cabinet and shattered on the floor. She said it wasn't unusual for items to come out of the cabinets and break while they were here. She asked if I ever felt cold spots when I was upstairs. I said I thought it was always cool in the kitchen, but hadn't attributed it to anything ghostly. We had never experienced anything strange until the St. Christopher had disappeared. She told me not to worry, that it would show up. Well, it did show up. A few days later, as my husband was getting dressed, he asked me where I found his St. Christopher. I told him I hadn't found it, that I didn't know what he was talking about. He walked in the living room holding it. We both kind of laughed and said, "Thanks, Lindsay." The disappearance and reappearance of the St. Christopher continued throughout our stay at the house, although sometimes Lindsay would pull a joke on us and it didn't always reappear in the same place it disappeared. It sometimes showed up in the guest bedroom. We just learned to look for it, and if we didn't find it quickly, we knew it would show up. We weren't afraid of Lindsay. We thought of her affectionately and always thanked her when a missing item showed back up. We had friends who were doubters, but that was okay. One evening we had a friend over and were just sitting down to dinner. The stairs to the upstairs apartment were visible through the dining alcove window. As we plated our food, the footsteps started upstairs. We were so used to them that we didn't really pay it that much attention. Our friend, however, commented and asked who was up there. We said it was probably just Lindsay. Well, being the big, tough ex-military guy he was, he laughed that off and said it was ridiculous. My husband told him he'd get the key and they could go check. My husband, knowing that nobody was up there. Our apartment was small, so just walking out the door and up the stairs would have given anyone time to leave, and this was the only entry or exit. I sat and waited for them to come back in. Not only did our friend not come back in to finish his dinner, he never came inside again. We had been living there a few months when one of the owners asked if our electric bill had increased drastically. I told him it hadn't. He said that theirs had more than tripled, although the only thing that was really on was the refrigerator and they didn't come to the house very often, so they were puzzled as to why the bill would be so high. We thought no more about it. Not too long after the electric bill problem had occurred, we started being awakened by the alarm radio blasting from upstairs in the early hours of the morning. We didn't think that anyone was staying upstairs, but we had given our key to the family because someone had lost theirs, so we weren't able to investigate. This continued for several mornings. A few days after the alarm clock incident, we would be awakened to what seemed to be spotlights coming from upstairs and would illuminate our bedroom. The living dining room upstairs was over our master bedroom downstairs. I asked my coworker/owner of the house if someone was staying upstairs. He gave me a confused look and asked why I was asking. I told him about the alarm clock radio and the light coming on at weird hours. He looked a little shocked and said, "That's not possible. We had the electricity turned off." In the months remaining that we lived in the house that we loved so much, the footsteps continued, the alarm clock continued to sound, the lights continued to come on, and a strange new sound emerged. In the very early hours of the morning, the alarm radio was replaced by what we determined sounded like popcorn. It was the sound popcorn makes as it begins to get hot and pop slowly, then as the kernels all heat, the sound would intensify as if getting to the end of a popping cycle. Well, later we agreed that it didn't sound so much like popcorn as gunfire. Lindsay was shot. That's how she died. By this time, we were so accustomed to the strange activities of the house that all we had to say was, "Stop, Lindsay," or "That's enough, Lindsay," and the sounds would stop and the lights would go out. While living in the house, we went to Miami for a class reunion. We were lying in bed and turned the TV off with the remote and laid it on the table beside us. The TV came back on. I picked up the remote and turned it off again. As soon as I laid the remote down, the TV came back on. My husband and I looked at each other and said, "Lindsay." I said, "That's enough, Lindsay," and the TV went off and stayed off. We loved our time in the Lindsay house and were very sad to leave South Carolina and move to another state and leave her. We settled into a new house and new routines. For many months, although we were hundreds of miles from our little beach house, the St. Christopher continued to play hide and seek and show up in unexpected places. This is my true story.